I'd like to call this May 17th meeting of the Economic Development and Housing Commission to order. Mr. Altamariano, would you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Pleasure. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Tonight's agenda is available on the counter, along with a request to speak cards. A reminder to everyone that a request to speak card should be completed and turned into the clerk prior to the completion of any staff presentation. For those speakers wishing to speak on an item not on the agenda but within the jurisdiction of this commission, please write item number 1 on your card. All speakers will be limited to 3 minutes. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and televised, so all speakers, in order to be recognized, must be called on by the chair and come forward to the microphone. Speaking in public may cause some individuals to be uncomfortable, so everyone is asked to be professional and respectful at all times. I'd like to move on to item number 1. There are no presentations this evening from the public about items not on the agenda, so I'll move on to item number 2, consideration of approval of the March 22nd Economic Development and Housing Commission meeting minutes. Can I have a motion to approve the meeting minutes, please?
I move that we approve the minutes.
I second that motion.
So we have a motion by Commissioner White, a second by Commissioner Altamariano. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Moving on to item number 3, a presentation of the update to the Homeless Action Plan. Mr. Laurel,
Good
you'll
evening,
be giving
Mr.
that
Chair.
presentation?
We'll actually be teaming the presentation, so it's a longer one than we're used to doing here. Did any of you happen to catch the council meeting last week? Not the part that was 11 o'clock, but
I saw it was
a
the
little
last,
earlier than that. This item,
was the last one on the agenda, correct?
it was, but we actually got it moved up. We had a lot of guest speakers there, so the council actually took this item up last week. So we're a little bit out of order in terms of how we like to present things to the commission, but we felt with the topic and definitely under the purview of this commission, it was important to bring it back. And the point of going to council last week wasn't to address any immediate action. So usually when we go to the commissions for issues, we want to get your direction first and then bring it to council. So this one was more of a workshop and update on a variety of topics. So we're here tonight. We'll definitely be back on the topic of homelessness as we go forward. But for tonight's presentation, we wanted to adapt what we did to council, get you caught up to speed on everything that's happened since 2013 when we adopted the Homeless Action Plan, and give you a highlight of what we plan to do going forward to continue to address homelessness in West Sacramento. So I'm going to start just with kind of a big picture overview, then Louise is going to go through an update on what has happened since the Homeless Action Plan was adopted. I don't know if any of you were on the Housing Commission back in 2013 when that got done, but it was a product that went through the commission process. And then we're both going to kind of talk about the status of homelessness. We have recent homeless count data. We also did a motel survey, so I'm going to cover that. Louise is going to cover the homeless numbers. And then we're going to close with a discussion of new funding sources and recommendations related to those sources. That's really where the focus was for the city council the other night. So as we go forward, this information is meant to inform what we do related to those various funding sources. So this is a very simplified graphic to illustrate kind of how I see the big picture of homelessness, kind of the overall approach the city is going with now. The way I describe it is it is a comprehensive approach to homelessness. It's not focusing on just one area. For many years, there were different theories about how to best address it. Housing first is a popular thing, but in our experience, you really don't manage homelessness well, and really it is that's the word, it's manage the issue well, unless you take a comprehensive approach to it. That includes being diligent about enforcement on illegal camping and other associated activities with homelessness. It means you're protecting your open spaces and not leaving vulnerable spaces for encampments to occur. So that's sort of on the enforcement, cleanup, and maintenance side. But then on the services side, and that includes housing, you have to have that as well, obviously. You're always going to have issues in a town, especially like ours, where we have the geography, both being close to downtown, and the same reason people like living in West Sacramento. A lot of the reasons are true for why people are homeless in West Sacramento. It's a good location, but we also have those spaces that tend to be vulnerable to encampments along the riverfront, some of the open spaces. So what we've really done a good job of, and Louise will get into it, is connect with the county since 2013 to really revamp what we're doing in terms of the service delivery, putting the county first, putting services first. So when we go into encampments, they're being met with services. So that's part of it. That's a huge part of it. But housing is another piece. And in order to really see the numbers go down, if you ask me, you need all these things. And especially you need the open space maintenance combined with the housing solutions, so that you're managing on the one hand, but you're also affecting the outcomes for people on the services and housing side. So that's kind of what this presentation is about, is telling you what we've done in each one of those categories. I'm going to come back to this later. But I'm going to turn it over to Louise at this point. She's going to talk about some of the highlights since we adopted the plan back in 2013. Thanks.
Okay.
So good evening.
Hello. Good evening.
In 2013, the city embarked on an effort to study what was happening surrounding homelessness in West Sacramento. What were the effects on the community? What were the effects on the persons who were homeless in our city? Who were the stakeholders? What were service providers were there? What were they doing? Because there were some services that were available, but they were very disorganized. One didn't connect with the other. And there was definitely a lack of many types of services that we felt were needed to address homelessness. That was a 5-month study that included a stakeholder group that met probably 6 or 7 times, about 35, 40 people. It included service providers, it included interviews, it included homeless persons, it included the county, the city, the police department, property owners, residents who had been impacted by homeless folks, business owners who'd been impacted by the homeless community. And what we were hearing was we were needing these 4 items to focus on to really start addressing or managing our homeless issues. One was enhancing public safety so people felt safe walking down the streets. Secondly, improving communication and coordination between the city and all these other entities that are involved with homelessness. And probably the county was the one that was most significant, because the county is a lead agency when it comes to services like food and mental health and public health and financial assistance and Social Security. The county does all of those programs, and they really didn't have a strong presence in West Sacramento on some of those at the time. So we wanted to use what we had learned and expand what resources we had available to address homelessness in West Sacramento. And most importantly, we wanted an effective delivery system. At the time, you all may remember, there was the Broader Christian Center building had burnt down, and several years later, there were some people serving food on the boat ramp. There were some churches doing things. There were things going on, but they weren't coordinated, and you really couldn't see that you could take a homeless person and make an impact on their life with anything that was happening. It was just sort of keeping it at that same level. There was no improvements. We couldn't help people get out of homelessness that way. So, one of the things that came out of that study was the major thing was the Homeless Action Plan. And one of the major portions of that action plan was the hiring of our first homeless coordinator and dedication of senior lead officers in the police department just specifically addressing homelessness so that they could learn who these folks were, learn where they were located, figure out what was going on, and track information. Starting last summer, we actually had an initial coordinator, Ryan Collins, who definitely got the program off the ground. And then last summer, we hired Mark Sawyer, who took over that position, and he started a program of visitations. So he goes out and visits folks right in the camps. They don't have to come to an office. They don't have to come to him. And then he got the police department to sometimes come with him so that the police department would get a better understanding of who was where and what they needed. And then he got the county to send service providers, since he's had the homeless shelter in Woodland has come out and actually done intake interviews and things right there on site. The county mental health agreed to create a mental health services team at one, and sometimes their mental health services team will go out with Mark. So he has been bringing the services directly to the homeless. And in addition, as I think Erin mentioned, we were tracking that information. Someone mentioned before we started the Appledore program, which was started from the Startup in Residence program. So these tech geniuses who know all about stuff that I don't know about came and worked directly with the city, directly with the police department, walked around the camps. They said, what data do you need to help improve your programs and your public safety? And we said, well, we want to be able to track the camps to see where people are. We want to know, where, before problems happen, we want to know what's going on. And we also want to, if someone's applied for services and they have no address, then you can't tell them, you can't put an address of, third tent from the left. We need to be able to find someone when services are available. So Appledore has a GPS tracking system where we can really get a handle on what's going on in our city. And the police department's really starting to get some good data out of it. These young folks created this and built this from the ground up specifically for our needs, but in hopes that this would be a platform that could be purchased and used by other jurisdictions someday. We were working on this services first model. A lot of people talk about housing first, where you take people directly off the street and put them into housing. And it is effective, but it is also very expensive, and you have to have the units available. And we all know that our housing market is tight in our area. It's very difficult to implement that in California. I think that they have a little, in some areas of the country, it's a little easier. But we were finding that our services first approach is actually getting people into housing too. Okay, I am clicking and nothing's happening. Okay, yes, please. Next slide. Thank you. So, as I mentioned, the county is our key partner when it comes to homelessness. They are the lead on service delivery, and the city does provide a small amount of support for, over a decade we've been paying towards the cost of the county's position called homeless coordinator. The county homeless coordinator does not do what our homeless coordinator does. She coordinates programs. She doesn't work direct. She doesn't do direct services, but she's critical piece of the infrastructure because she keeps everything together. She has been really a wonderful partner, Tracy Dickinson, with the county. And the city sends the county $20,000 a year. It's split between a portion of the county homeless coordinator salary, and also about $10,000 of it goes each year towards overhead at the shelter in Woodland. Fourth and Hope, thank you. Browder Christian Center is now Shores of Hope, and what used to be the Woodland Shelter is now Fourth and Hope. And I always have to stop and think about which hope I'm talking about. Another thing the county is leading on is the homeless coordinator helps to coordinate, is the HPAC, the Homeless and Poverty Action Coalition. And they are working on developing an HMIS, a homeless management system. This is a kind of a national thing. HUD is requiring people to do this nationally, and it's called Coordinated Entry System. So if someone is working, let's say someone applies for Social Security, a Social Security intake worker could get all the information needed for this person to get their Social Security, but maybe they're also eligible for food stamps, or maybe they also need housing, or maybe they need mental health, or maybe they need something else. They can put all the data in the HMIS and directly do a referral to that other agency, and that person doesn't have to go through the whole spiel again. Their data is there. Privacy Act issues make it difficult to work with, but we're working through that. So we're going to get it up and working. They have this working in some areas, and it's very helpful. It really makes it a lot easier to get people the services that are needed. Okay, click again. Yeah, it's not liking me today. So we had a little mini case study recently on how our program would work if we did services first, and that was behind River Point Center, where there was there were a few camps that were popping up, and it was getting to be more and more. We were getting complaints from some of the businesses of trash and panhandling and such. We went out and started, instead of going out and doing a cleanup, walking out, posting a notice saying, you got to move your tent, we're going to come out with a big dumpster and throw away all the trash, and being done. We've done that over and over again over the years. It's expensive, it takes a lot of time, and people just move to another location and then come back. It's like trying to dig a hole in the sand, and the sand just keeps coming back. So what we did with Mark's help was the police department, Mark, and some of these other service providers went out to the camp week after week on visitations, saying, this is coming up, you're going to have to move your tent, but let's work on some services. And they did this week after week, and when the day of the cleanup arrived, they didn't have anybody to move. They had all either gotten into services, gotten into programs, or left on their own because they'd had sufficient notice and found a way to move their stuff. So it took 3 months. That's a whole lot more time and effort than walking in there one day, but it's a lot more effective because those folks, most of them ended up in services and probably will not come back. So the police department was using, I believe they were using Appledore on that, and thank you. And so they're tracking what's happening to those folks. Another issue we had was open space maintenance, because a lot people, if they're camping, they want to be in a secluded area. So the Parks Department has spent many hours and a lot of money raising up the vegetation screen, so topping the trees off a little higher, taking down the bushes. And the goats are probably the most famous face of that. Everybody loves the goats. Those are used in the more remote areas where it's rough terrain, difficult to get a mower or vehicles in. But the Parks Department is doing this on a daily basis, and we have seen that be effective also. We have a number of other partners in addition to the county. There's a group of faith-based organizations that organized a number of years ago called the Mercy Coalition. Some of their members participated in our homeless study in our stakeholder group, and when Broader Christian Center could no longer provide lunchtime meals for the homeless, they took that over, so they're providing them. And they coordinated with the county, so they're no longer at the Broader boat ramp, which was really causing problems. They got them to move over to the county services office on Jefferson. And the good thing about that is people are then a few steps away from walking into that county office where the services are provided. So we found that it's been a really good way to link people with services. The food is there, the food is the attractor, and then the services are so close and so available. And because it's not in a secluded area like the boat ramp, we don't have nearly as much trouble with the trash and that sort of thing that we had before. So I think a lot of times people think that the city and the county should fix all the problems, and we forget that we have such really powerful allies in our community members. Bridge to Housing was probably our most auspicious attempt to address homelessness. It was a pilot program done in 2015 where we basically took over one of the motels. We master leased a motel and moved 65 people off the river into the motel, and then gave them wraparound services. That's the technical term. Basically, you provide any service that individual or that family needs to get into permanent housing. Not everybody succeeded, but honestly, most people didn't gave us, we figured when we started we'd get like 10-15% into permanent housing, and maybe some folks would go into drug rehab or something like that. But to have the majority of them end up in permanent housing and half of them today still in housing 2 years later, that was pretty remarkable. It was costly, and it was very staff intensive, but it did work. Our biggest obstacle was, there were a number of obstacles, but one big obstacle was the fact that you can't find 65 vacant units, rental units in West Sacramento all at one time. So we didn't quite see that from the beginning. So we found that we need to work on that end of it, is having units available, because a lot of landlords they want a credit check, they want a background check, they want first month's rent and last month's rent and deposit, and many of these folks didn't have all those things. So the number of landlords that were willing to work with us was limited, and the number of units available was limited. So we really had to scramble to get that. So that's one thing that we know that we need to work on, is having more units available, not just vacant rental units, but units that are affordable to people that are at the far low end of the income stream and that probably have a bad rental history. They probably have had evictions. You know, we need case management so that those folks can get into a unit and maintain that unit, and someone that can be the link between the tenant and the landlord is the case manager that can make sure that that tenant remains a good tenant and keeps that house. So 32 people out of those original 65 are still permanently housed, which is, and for a homeless program and permanent housing, that's a pretty solid outcome. Every 2 years, HUD requires that recipients of HUD funding for homelessness conduct what's called a PIT count, a point-in-time count. So what we do is we go out on we pick one day, and it's always in January. HUD makes us do it in January. One day, and we try and count all the homeless people in West Sacramento. And actually, it's YOLO. They do it all over the United States, but ours is a YOLO County count. So then we just look at the West Sacramento numbers from that count. And you can see from the numbers here that we divide it up between people who are sheltered, which means that they are living in some type of shelter, transitional housing. They might be in a motel with a voucher that's paid for by some organization, versus unsheltered, which are basically the people that are in the camps. And our sheltered count dropped dramatically, almost half in 2015. And that was because it happened right in the middle of Bridge to Housing, where we'd just taken 65 people off the river. But we pretty much maintained that 2 years later in 2017. And that was, I think, a really big eye-opener for me, was the fact that we didn't just take people off the river, they didn't return to the river. Can you go back a second? One more. Another thing that's important is to notice that of the 174 that were counted this year, 74% had lived in Yolo County for 7 years or more. And a third of them grew up in West Sacramento. So a lot of people get the impression that the homeless come from somewhere else. Well, some of them do, but many of them are the people that are born and raised here and have had some sort of unfortunate circumstance that has put them on this path towards homelessness. Well, many of them are our friends and neighbors. Yeah, there we go. There, now you can see on the screen, you can see the pit count, where the unsheltered went from 126 in 2013 down to 80 in 2015, and only up a few to 87 in 2017. And honestly, this year we did a way more intensive search for people out in the most remote areas. We had the police department help us. And so my guess is the reason the numbers are a little bit higher is just that we did a better job of finding folks that normally are not wanting to be found. So there was, I think they kind of focused on 3 locations. They had the camps in Southport and along the Deepwater Ship Channel was one focus, the Broader Boat Ramp area north of that, the West Cap Corridor, and then they talked to people at the lunch program over at the county offices. So they tried to get, as I think they did a really good job of getting into some of the more remote areas this year. Let's see. Also, I don't think I mentioned this before, but our homeless coordinator, he started doing office hours in addition to going out and visiting in the camps. He decided, because he found that scheduling an appointment with someone who's homeless was not really working well. So he said, okay, Thursday mornings from 8 to noon, I got an office in the police department, come see me. And he wasn't even sure whether people would want to go, especially since it's in the police department. But he started that mid-August. He says he's had 104 people come for appointments since then. 2/3 of those were Yolo County residents. So only a third were from other areas. And out of those 104, 64 eventually received housing. So he is doing a really phenomenal job. And a part of that is also the fact that the county has a housing navigator position. So he works with the housing navigator. The housing navigator is basically someone who's signed to do whatever it takes to get you into housing. So if you don't have a driver's license because you lost your ID, he takes you and sits in the DMV all day long and gets you a driver's license. If you need a Social Security card, if you need to sign up for Social Security so you can get enough income to rent a place, he'll walk you through the Social Security process. Unfortunately, that position is not going to be funded next year, but that has also been a really a big boon to our homeless program. Okay, I think Aaron's going to take over from here.
Okay.
Okay, so I mentioned that we recently did a survey of motel residents, and the reason we linked these two issues, because it really is a homeless issue, and the data that we found through the motel survey supported that. So the PIT census, as Louise mentioned, you're only considered sheltered homeless if someone like a government agency or some service organization is paying your rent. So we know the motels are full of people that are paying their own rent. They just don't have enough money to pay their own rent. And so they're the most marginally housed people in our community. A lot of the people that are in the motels have Social Security benefits, and they may have a payee service that's assigned to them because they've been deemed not able to manage their money. The payee really isn't there to be their guardian. It's more just to do that, to manage their money. And inevitably what happens is the SSI only goes for so many weeks and, rents a full month, and they're out in the street every month. It's a cycle that just perpetuates over and over. And we know this happens. The survey was really the evidence that proved that. And so just to run through the data on this, we had 105 people that were surveyed. We estimate that to be roughly a third of the motel residents. So that's a pretty good count when you're looking at just a cross-section of the population. But the stats that we're most telling is 43% were Sacramento County residents, and you can go down the list here, 37% were actually from out of the region or other counties or even other states. Only 17% identified themselves as being West Sacramentans. So that was a very telling stat, and a few others from Yolo County. But at the bottom there, 75% of them, the vast majority of the residents in the motels received SSI. And as I mentioned, the payees, about a quarter of the SSI recipients had a payee. So this is not precise math, but if you're just looking at this data and trying to draw some kind of logical conclusion from it, you can see that about 80% of the motel residents, of those 105 anyway, are from outside of West Sacramento. So that proves what we already knew. But what's more telling is if you take a straight line on that 75% of the residents and apply that to the 80% that are outside of town, you can draw the conclusion that 60% or so are receiving SSI from another county, and they're living in our motels. So that shows you right there, West Sacramento, yes, we have a homeless issue that generates from our own population, but we're also affected by what we have, and there's a long history there, obviously, with the motels, but they are the primary source of housing for the most marginally housed people, arguably in the region. The largest source of housing for them is here. So what that means to our overall strategy, it's complicated because on the one hand, we can't force Sacramento County and other places to not send people, or their payees to not send people here. But we can do things to try to affect that system and affect some of the quality of life outcomes for the people that are being housed here. So that's one reason, going back to this chart, and it's not on this list, I don't think, but we did a motel ordinance update recently. So we adopted some changes to the motel inspection program that moved it away from kind of just a code enforcement focused, you have some problems, fix these, and we'll fix your case. Now it's a pass, not pass system. So if our code enforcement officers go to inspect the motel and they note there's, unsafe or unsanitary conditions, it's a fail. So what that is intended to do is to inform the payee services and other people that are putting people in motels that, have the conscience to not put people in a motel that's failing, at least put them in a safe sanitary unit. So it remains to be seen how that's going to work out, but that's at least one way the city is taking an action to affect that issue. So I want to go back to this and taking off on what Louise talked about and some of the outcomes from the Homeless Action Plan. And this kind of fills in the blanks on what we've done there. What we've intended to do with this workshop and with the city council last week was to identify where some of the gaps might be in our overall system. So I think we're doing a great job, as we talked about, in establishing kind of the comprehensive approach. As we said, with the homeless coordinator, the senior lead officers, the PD really embracing the services first approach to managing the camps. Parks Department is the lead on open space protection, and they're doing a really thorough job on making sure that spaces don't become vulnerable. The county, I would say we had a unprecedented level of coordination between the city and the county on this issue. Really started with this effort, the Homeless Action Plan. It manifested itself in Bridge to Housing. That's where we really saw the focus and saw what could be done when all the coordination happens. But as we're finding now, where some of the gaps are on the services side, it really has to do with two things. One is, as Louise mentioned, getting the county focused on West Sacramento specific issues. Housing navigation is a huge one here, to make sure that we have someone that our homeless coordinator can refer people to and, get them housed, do whatever it takes to get them housed. That's really not his job, but it's something that he does a little bit of also. So that's an area where we really identified there could be some improvement at the city-county level in dedicating some county resources to that effort. But then on the housing side, we have a huge number of affordable housing units in West Sacramento. Almost 10% of our overall housing stock is affordable housing. What I mean by that is regulated. We have financing agreements or regulatory agreements with those, but they're not at the income levels that are going to support someone who's chronically homeless or just off the street. So that's a definite gap, and there are solutions to that out there. But that's an area where, our city council is going to, have to get comfortable with what some of those solutions might mean. And I will get into that in a minute. But going forward, this really illustrates the challenges we have. So open space is an interesting issue because what we've been doing, the way our parks and police departments describe it, is taking care of the low-hanging fruit. We've been going into the areas that are most visible, but needed the pruning and the vegetation control, benefited from the goats being out there. But what we're finding now, and it sort of showed with the homeless census, is that the homeless are still there. They're just not as visible. You see them on the street, but in order to find the camps, it really means going into some hard to reach places. So that creates challenges for our maintenance program because it's not as simple as just seeing a camp, limbing trees and being done with it. We have just on the top picture is the Stonelock property, and that's just one half of Stonelock. And it's also known as the Honda Hills because of the geography out there, the topography. So it's a challenging area to maintain, and that's one of the areas where we can't afford to lose if we want to maintain a manageable homeless count. The other one is the North Levee, where we took the population from Bridge to Housing out of that area, and that's been maintained very well since we did Bridge to Housing, but you have to sustain that effort in order to keep the problem under control. So that's kind of on the open space issue. The housing issue, as I mentioned, we have plenty of affordable housing. We don't have enough housing to meet the needs of our homeless. We have motels, and that's what's doing it right now. So what that means is a couple of things. I mentioned the housing navigation services that are really vital to creating those links, but also in a lot of places they're doing supportive housing, which is housing that's designed specifically for people who are formerly homeless and wraparound services, a lot like we did with Bridge to Housing, but in a more permanent way. It's a dedicated property for that purpose. So a lot of the discussion at the city council level was about the funding sources that are available now. A lot of them are tailored to doing permanent supportive housing. I'm not here to tell you that that's where we're going, that we're going to launch into a project, but we are having conversations, exploring different options. The feedback we heard from the city council on that topic was mainly that, and it's probably what you would agree with, is that we don't want to become a magnet. You don't want to do a project that doesn't have really solid restrictions and management in place to make sure that we're addressing our local issues and not becoming a resource for other agencies to bring their clients here. And there's ways to mitigate that, and that's kind of the work we're doing on the very preliminary stage to see how, if we did a project, how we would do it in a way that doesn't become a magnet. So just going through these funding sources very quickly, you all know about Measure E that was passed in November. It included a set aside of about $750,000 a year, at least that's the council's initial target, to address and reduce homelessness in the city. That's both on the impact on the community side and also on the services side. So we're now going through the process of figuring out the best uses for those funds, and the council will decide that ultimately through the budget. CDBG, you've seen us here a couple times. We became an entitlement city recently. Of course, CDBG is more than ever subject to threats at the federal level. We made it this year. We are getting an entitlement grant for at least the current fiscal year. We'll see beyond that, but at least for now, we have $400,000 that we will be allocated. We're recommending in the action plan that you had a public hearing on, I think one of your last meetings, to allocate those funds for property acquisition in support of affordable housing. That could mean supportive housing, but it could also mean more traditional affordable housing. So it gives us the flexibility we think we need to continue the planning work, but be able to shift if we decide, there's a better option for those funds. The topic in the city council meeting also focused on Sutter Health's Getting to Zero program. We adopted a resolution that night in support of that program. And this is really unprecedented. Sutter Health has put up $10 million of its own funds. They're looking to raise another $10 million to make those funds available to the region, just in Sacramento, Placer, and Yolo County, to address housing first options for homelessness. So we're talking to them. We're working on a proposal that we would apply for if everything kind of falls in line with what we want to do. But we are engaged in that effort. And then at the state level, there are a couple of major programs coming down. No Place Like Home is the big one. It has over $1 billion. They're going to roll it out over multiple years, but it looks like it's going to be at least $200 million a year for permanent supportive housing. So these are the recommendations we took to council. I don't want to spend a lot of time on these, but it had to do with Measure E, how we spend Measure E. This is also all laid out in the report in case you want more background. I talked about CDBG. We'll be back with the action plan. That's actually a city council action as our final approval, but we will provide an update at our July meeting on how we're moving forward with that plan. I already mentioned the support for the Sutter Health program. We'll continue to work on a proposal and get the city council's blessing, of course, before we actually submit it, and I'll continue to update you on what that entails. And on the other funding sources, we're just going to kind of monitor the notices of funding, which we expect to be out towards the beginning of next year. And we'll see if we have a project that might be ready for that. It's still very early for us on that. With the Mercy Coalition, we're going to continue to support what they're doing. They still do the food distributions at the county offices, and that's been a great way to get people front and center at the county services building, where also Mark Sawyer is right across the street at the PD. So that's been a really good nonprofit public effort to help people over there. And then finally on Yolo County, they've done a great job of getting grant funds. They have a kind of a high level in historic terms of grant funding available for mental health services and homelessness. So we're working with them to try to identify ways, as I mentioned before, to tailor what they do with those funds to best affect the outcomes here. What they do in Davis, what they do in Woodland, is not exactly what we need in West Sacramento. And that's a challenge on the one hand because the funding sources tend to be inflexible, but housing navigation is a great example. We have a huge need for that. And we know that here. I don't know that the same is true elsewhere in the county, but that's something we're talking to them about. So I believe that concludes the presentation. I know that was a lot of information all at once, but it's the same information the city council got last week, and we're here to answer your questions.
And we got the same version, correct?
You did, yes. Yes.
Thank you, Aaron, for your efforts, and this is a tremendous effort for a very daunting social issue throughout the state. I just this morning talked to a councilman across the river, and of course, we know that they're dealing with the same issues.
Multiplied.
Yes, on a larger scale. So are there any comments from the commission? Any questions of Mr. Laurel while he's here?
I'll go ahead and take a
Please,
minute.
Commissioner Campbell.
I think you have, the staff and the city is doing a tremendous job. The analysis looks comprehensive. I had a few questions as you were going through the presentation, and for the most part, you answered them. I'm always curious why Yolo County bears the burden and your hotel survey indicates there are a number of homeless residents in West Sac that come from outside. What is the relationship with Sacramento County? Do they have cost-sharing agreements,
Yeah, so
program services?
the clients that are identified as Sacramento County and receiving SSI from Sacramento County, maybe Louise can follow up my answer in terms of how the Sacramento County equivalent to Yolo County here plays into that, but at least for the payees, the quarter of those residents that are assigned to a payee, that's really where it begins and ends. The payee is responsible for managing their money, and they're looking around the region, where do you put someone with this much money for, for that period of time? We're a target. We have 30 motels still here, and you can go to the other places where we know where they are, Stockton Boulevard, Auburn Boulevard, they're disappearing. Here, we still have a high concentration, and I think that's the main reason we still see the brunt of the effect of people coming from outside Yolo County. Can you speak at all to the Sacramento County interface there?
Well, something that you need to be aware of is that if they're receiving SSI from Sacramento County, then that means they've declared themselves as a Sacramento County resident, which means they're ineligible for mental health services, food stamps, that sort of thing from Yolo County. So they have to go back to Sacramento County to get all of those things. So if they need services, those services are not here where they're living. So there's a lot of back and forth, I'm sure, but there is no, at this point in time, there is no cost sharing because the costs are borne by Sacramento County. Now, whether the folks can access them or not easily when they're living here, that's a separate question.
Yeah, I'm sure there's no answer to it, but it strikes me that this problem is regional and not Yolo County. So I'm always looking for hope that the jurisdictions, neighboring jurisdictions are working collaboratively and, focusing on a multi-jurisdictional problem and not necessarily burdening. It's not my concern that they're burdening West Sacramento, but the problem itself, simply transportation between West Sacramento and Sacramento, or my next question hinged on this, the temporary housing facility, the homeless shelter, is in Woodland. And we know that's not convenient for people without resources. So I'm, confused as to why there isn't greater, both from a cost perspective, sharing of financial resources, but problem solving and service agreements that make it easier and lessen the burden on specific communities. But, not a question to be answered.
It is a very good question, and one that I would love to know the answer to, honestly. But a part of the problem is that when we talk about services, from county services, this is not county money. It usually comes from the federal government, sometimes through the state to the county, sometimes directly to the county. And it is, one of the requirements usually is you can only serve the residents of your county with this money. So it makes it very parochial, even though they may be seeing the very same people walking. I mean, how long does it take to walk across that bridge? Not long. But a lot of the funding sources kind of are entrenched into the way the services are provided. And it's something that we probably need to work on. And on the Yolo County HPAC, the Homeless Poverty and Action Coalition, has been starting to work with the programs in Sacramento, which never happened before. So like our HMIS system, I believe we're going to be using the Sacramento HMIS. They're going to just set up their own module for Yolo County. but there will be some limited ability to actually share data, which has never happened before. So some of those discussions have started a little bit, but a lot more work probably needs to be done.
And on the housing side also, just to address the question, because I get asked a lot over the last 12 years since I've been here, why doesn't West Sacramento have a homeless shelter? And there are a lot of reasons for that, but I think to answer that question now, I would say the world has sort of evolved in terms of what is the best solution for a local homeless issue. I would argue at this stage, a homeless shelter really isn't the answer for West Sacramento, because all those issues that we deal with already, where we are a magnet for other reasons because of, you know, our motels and other factors, you really have a harder time managing that issue through shelter housing than you do through the new models, which are, supportive housing isn't a new model exactly, but it's one that you can institute more, you know, more controls and more tailored solutions to a local issue through a supportive housing project than you can through an emergency shelter. And so I think that's why we're at least looking at that as a potential solution. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to affect first and foremost is the outcomes for the people who have the West Sacramento connection, the 75% or whatever the number was that identify of being here for more than, you know, 7 years and are from West Sacramento. We want to start there, and you're right, it is a regional issue and it needs to be addressed regionally. But I think starting with a strategy that focuses on your own is a good place to begin, and that leads to a more regional discussion about, you know, some of these other issues. So that's kind of where we're at on the housing piece.
Yeah, again, I really just want to recognize the sort of counterproductive, counterintuitive approach that HUD and a number of the funding agencies take on this. I compliment West Sacramento for being more focused on the dynamics within the community and identifying solutions that address the situation here locally. Last point, not a question. I'm a data guy. I think the ability to collect data on this particular population must be incredibly difficult, apart from privacy issues and personal concerns with the data. But the more data, the better I think you will be able to address
Extremely
the
useful.
specificity
Yeah.
of the problem here in town. But
Right.
I compliment you on that effort as well.
Yeah, the PD's been very innovative, just, you know, getting into the field and then using that Appledore software has been, has had a huge impact on our strategy. So I
They
think
aren't using drones by any chance?
No, not yet.
No, they are
That's-
walking, like I said, they're doing visits, you know, they're walking out there and getting into the brush and talking to people, getting to know them. Our homeless coordinator, you know, those 87 unsheltered people, he probably knows every single one of them by name. He visits them on a regular basis. He offers them help, he offers them referrals. So it's that high-tech data combined with the very low-tech on the ground, just getting out there in the dirt and doing it.
Erin, I have two questions. First is, you mentioned the number of motel residents that have other payees. Do you have any idea how many of those payees are the motel owners?
We don't.
I don't think the payees are generally, the payees, there are some that are nonprofits, there are some that are for-profits, but they're usually an organization and that's all they
Right.
do. There's several, I think there's at least 2 or 3 larger ones that are for-profit payees.
Yeah, and I don't know
So-
that our survey data traced back the actual payee service that was being used. Again, that's one of
think
the
that
hard
would be
parts of collecting data, but I can check on that. 'Cause
part of that
I'm
data
actually not sure.
Because I think that may be one of the reasons that we have Sacramento residents living here, is because of the relationships between the motel owners that own multiple properties on both sides of the river and the for-profit payee.
I'm sure that has something to do with it. I can try to check back on how we collected data, see if we made that connection, but at this point, I'm not sure that,
So,
it's an interesting anecdote though, but we don't,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, they have a relationship in that the payee doesn't tell the client, you have to live here. The client says, I want to spend here, a night here, will you pay my rent to this?
Yeah, that was
hotel
not the
owner?"
way that it worked at the old town
But,
inn.
yes, but that, I mean, that's in theory. However, a lot of times the payees will say, I know there's rooms available here, and we've used that one before, you can go there, they'll take you. And the for-profit, they get a percentage of the payee's social security check. They take their cut and then they give the rest to the payee. And for many of them that are living in motels, the rest of that check goes directly to the motel. The payee gets very little. And that's one reason why you see them walking up and down the street with other cans in their bottles and going down here, down to the gas station to change those into cash, because they have no cash. They really have no money. So, so there's a lot of players involved, and although it's an impact on the community, I mean, the biggest impact is on the person themselves. We're talking about people that are receiving Social Security. They're either elderly, they're disabled, or they have some kind of mental health issue. So these are vulnerable populations.
Your other question?
The other question I have is, you've mentioned several times how important this housing navigator is, and yet that position is going away. Is there an opportunity to use some of the Measure E money to fund that position?
I would say the opportunity for Measure E, there aren't lines on how we can or can't use it. So from that standpoint, absolutely. But I also, the feedback we've received from the city council is that they're not interested in using Measure E in a way that would replace something that was already being done by, say, the county or another organization. So that's a needle we have to thread there, but I think whether it's Measure E, CDBG, I think it's, or the county, ideally we would like the county to shift resources to provide it. I think the important piece, whatever the solution is that it's done in a way that is tailored to West Sacramento. That the person that is working in that space is focused on West Sacramento clients, West Sacramento relationships, and not spread throughout the county. I think that's what we're going for there.
Sir, I have just a couple questions. Real quick, do you know how big of an issue it is with the unsafe motels? Is that a big issue or minor issue? Because my only concern is that if we're going to have like a no-pass system, and not give the motel owner an opportunity to fix any deficiencies, then we're probably losing potential shelter there.
Yeah, so just to be clear on that, we're not, through our pass not pass system, we're not precluding anyone from actually staying at the
okay.
not pass motels. It's more of a tool that we want to use to daylight to the payees and other service agencies that, hey, if you're gonna put people here, at least put them in a safe situation.
Okay.
So it does really two things there. It creates a better outcome for the clients themselves. That's most important, but it also puts the onus on the motel owners that are not keeping their properties up, that are now losing income to, we don't want them to necessarily, we're not saying go, turn into a Holiday Inn overnight,
Right.
but at least get the safe sanitary conditions up to par, so that, you can at least, if you're going to house people for that reason, they're not staying in a room that's infested by bugs.
Right.
So it's only,
Basic things like that, yeah.
it's only a room-by-room pass?
No, it's a property-based,
So the
yeah,
entire property?
right,
Okay.
right. So,
And then my second question, I think is maybe for Lori, regarding funding resources, I noticed we had some vets that were homeless. Is there any available funding from the Veterans Administration for help on this issue?
Well, we can get people linked up with the VA, because sometimes there is. It depends on what their categorization is, Did they have how long their service was and that sort of thing. So whenever we find someone with a history of being in the military, we immediately try and get them hooked up with the VA to see if they are eligible for any type of VA payments, VA medical, those sorts of things. As far as housing, the VA just generally doesn't pay for housing. There are some special Section 8 vouchers that are set aside for veterans, but the Housing Authority has to apply for them and get them. And HUD usually only gives them to housing authorities that are really close to a VA hospital. So, so far, I don't think Yolo County has been able to get any. I know they've applied. They apply for anything that comes along. Yolo County Housing Authority does. But I don't think they've been able to get any, they're called VASH vouchers. I don't think they've been able to get any VA supportive housing vouchers so far. And probably mainly because we're not really close to a VA hospital. There's other housing authorities that are closer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other discussion? Yes, sir.
Quick question. So it looks like the state of California, No Place Like Home is going to be a huge opportunity. Again, there's a long list of new funding resources. Without you having to go back on the slides, can you elaborate on how we're going to avoid becoming a magnet, given all these new monies and programs and funding we're bringing here, without becoming like the hub in the region?
Well, first of all, any project that receives funding through one of those sources, the city would just inherently be involved, whether it's as a financier or at its most basic, we're still involved on project approvals. I don't think a supportive housing project can move forward these days without, help from the local government. So in terms of managing where those monies are placed in terms of units on the ground, we have a heavy hand in managing that. So I think where the opportunity is for us to look at those funding sources, and if we come up with a solution that is a supportive housing deal that affects the outcomes we're trying to achieve, we would be in the driver's seat in terms of applying for that funding or Sutter Health or whatever it is. The challenge is tailoring those funding sources, which tend to have very general rules about how you manage a project to an outcome where we have a project on the ground that is taking in West Sacramento-based clients. That's a challenge. I don't think it's something we can't overcome through creative management and having the county be the service provider. So in that way, first of all, it's something we would be involved in, so it's not as if these will start popping up everywhere. And then secondly, if we are involved in one, we will take every measure we can to make sure it's addressing our issues and not becoming a magnet. So hopefully that answers.
Can I add
Sure.
something? Remember when I was talking, and I talked about how the majority of people that were homeless were Yolo County residents for 7 years plus? And then Aaron was talking and he was saying, well, in the motels, the majority of people are not Yolo County residents. That is because of the difference between the pit count and what we did with the count on the motels. The pit count follows the HUD standard procedure, which means if you're only homeless if you're in a motel for a short period of time and your rent's being paid by some official agency. So if the county is putting you in there with a voucher, if a church has given you a week's motel rent, you're homeless. If you're receiving SSI and you can only afford to live there for 2 weeks out of the month, if you slept there last night, you're not homeless. If you ran out of money today and you can't sleep there tonight, then you are homeless. So it makes no sense, but that's the difference. That's the thing to think about is when you're talking about a magnet, we already have the magnet. It's the motels. They're there. We already, so if we build permanent supportive housing that is targeted to the folks in West Sacramento who are actually on the street and are truly homeless, we're moving our people off the street. It's the magnet right now is not supportive housing. It's people that are being placed in the motels. So people that are being placed in the motels coming from Sacramento without services on site versus a permanent supportive housing project that will primarily serve West Sacramento or Yolo County homeless with services on site. There's a big difference in what those two things look like.
Thank you.
Any other comments?
Well, I
Yes.
don't necessarily have any questions, but I'm just really impressed with all of the research that you have done, and I think that having a clear vision of what the problem is, and the fact that there's 87 unsheltered people, that seems so manageable, so doable for the city of West Sacramento to sort of put the kibosh on homelessness and have people in supportive housing. And it's just figuring out, and, you know, with all of the resources of funding available, I think this is absolutely doable, and I think it's really wonderful what you guys are doing, and I think that our whole community is gonna benefit. So thank you for all of your.
Yeah, thanks. I think that is a comment that has been echoed, that when you look at the numbers, you know, you look at it and it's exactly that. You feel like it can be manageable. I don't know if it's solvable, but that's kind of our approach, is we're trying to reduce that number, and but at the same time not reduce it in a way that simply, you know, moves people on. We're actually creating solutions that lead to better lives for the 85 or 87 that we have unsheltered. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, and I'd just like to say I've seen the plan in action. I've seen the brush cut down out there by the barn along the river. That's almost down to lawn manageable. You and I talked about a property on Delta Lane. I actually met a police officer out there, and that camp is gone. So I've seen the action and the coordination take place. So this has been very effective, and again, thank you both for this presentation.
All right, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So, moving on to item number 4A, request for comments from the commissioners. Any comments, concerns, fellow commissioners? Nope. Okay, moving on to 4B, staff update.
Yes, just briefly, I wanted to give you a highlight of your next meeting. We will have Verna Sulpizio from the Chamber of Commerce to give which I think will be an annual update. I'm still having to backtrack to figure out what the latest update is, but it'll be an update on the Chamber's activities under the city contract. So she'll be here. I think we may have another item or two, but that's going to be the highlight for that meeting. Also, we'll give you an update at that point on, as I mentioned, on the CDBG program. We hope to have that to City Council probably in the July meeting, but we'll let you know the status of that. Yeah, and then on the next item on the calendar, just one thing that's coming up, or actually a couple things. One, I'm sorry for the short notice on this, but this Friday, the project down Delta Lane, it's called West Gateway Place. We're having a grand opening at 10 o'clock on Friday. So there'll be a tour. It's actually fully occupied, so the project's already in service. So it'll be a good opportunity to see a brand new affordable housing project and some of the faces of who we're serving over there at the property. So I'd encourage you, if you can attend, stop by. I think they're going to have a food truck or something, but it should be a good event. And then the other one, you've all got an email from Polly, and I think I've heard from everyone. State of the City is on May 31st. It'll be the normal time, starts in the cocktail hour around 5:30, I think, and then the rest of the program. So a number of you have asked for a seat at the city table, so got all those arrangements made, and looking forward to seeing you there. Thanks.
Great, thank you for the invite.
Thank you. The next meeting, do you have that date?
It's July 19th. Thank you, Polly. It's July.
Any other business? There being none, I'd like to call for an adjournment. Thank you.